You're listening to 107.7 Stake FM.
Okay, talk to me about 24-bit versus 32-bit or different hertz levels of recording.
Yep.
Talk to me about the things, the inner mechanics or like this presettings that determine if something is wildly better or not.
Yeah.
Or is it like 1080p versus 4K where you're like, well, these are kind of like close enough that you don't need to?
Yeah, so I'll start with bit depth because that one is somehow more interesting to me.
Sure.
And cool. So what you end up having is 32-bit between 24-bit and 32-bit. You can't hear the difference. There's no audible thing. 16 to 24 there is. And specifically where it comes in is low level. Like when things start getting quiet, you can actually lose samples all the way. Because, you know, if you have a sine wave, you know, in real life, in full fidelity of ears and organic things, like the bit depth is essentially infinite. Like the curve is actually a full curve.
Like recording at 1,000,000 bit.
Infinite bit. Like forever. That there are, infinitely close together. But with, you know, once it gets into a computer, you can only sample so many times per second. Like, where's it now? Where's it now? Where's it now? Where's it now? So with 16-bit, you have, I can't remember the exact number. It's 2 to the 16. 2 to the 16 values of volume.
Okay.
In 24-bit, you have 2 to the 24, which one is in the millions, one's in the billions. And it's huge difference. So if you have, that's what dither is for. You ever seen dither? So in mastering process and other things, in limiters you'll see it sometimes, like dither. And what it is, it's this low level noise, like essentially tape hiss, that's really low to keep it so you don't lose bit information. Because it'll just disappear. Like if things get too quiet, like you'll have like pretty imperceptible, but if you're listening, dropouts.
Are you talking about as far as signal strength, if you're recording at a level on the input that is like very minuscule?
Or even on the output, like you can hear it. You can hear 16-bit really well. A good test is the long fade out of a song. Then listen to the end of it because you can hear it start to like.
I see.
You start to lose stuff. And you know, if you're a punk band, 16-bit dither doesn't matter. No one cares. But if you're like, you know, a folk band that really is pushing for dynamic range, like it matters then.
Yeah.
And then, you know, 44.1 versus 48 versus 88.2 versus 96 versus 188, whatever. I don't know what the one above that is, but then the 192.
We're talking hertz now, right?
Yes, now we're talking hertz. That's how many times it samples a bit per second. So 44.1, there's 44,100 samples per second.
Okay.
48,000 samples per second. 96, you know, 1,000 samples per second. That's the difference.
Right.
The reason that there's two that close to each other, 44.1 is for CDs.
Right.
It's for music. 48 is for movies. Just the way, you know, things get printed out. That's how it ends up being. And same, 88.2 is for music. 96 is for movies.
Okay.
TV.
Okay. So it's like the next step up if you're going for fidelity. Like in Hollywood movies are dealing with that level now?
Well, it's just the same way like TV or movies were 24 frames a second, TV was 30 frames a second. It's just kind of what it was. Like
Gotcha.
they picked it.
Yeah.
And movies picked 48. So that's why it exists. Like you can't hear the difference between 44.1 and 48. Like there's no audible difference.
Okay.
And then say we've sampled at 20,000 instead of 44. Anything above 10K, the way that it works, you get this aliasing where it reflects back the frequency. So if you're recording at 20 hertz and there's 15, if you're recording at 20K hertz and you have 15K hertz frequency that goes through it, you will hear it at 15 and you'll hear it at 5. You'll get this weird ghosting on the other side of it. It's the way the algorithm works that does the sampling. So that's why it needs to be 44 to be out of the range of human hearing. So any aliasing, you don't hear it because it's above the range of human hearing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's this bizarre thing.
Yeah. Interesting.
So, and I used to think, I used to do a lot of, like, when we were recording bluegrass in Nashville, we did a lot of 88.2 with the idea that it's higher fidelity and all that. I think it was true then because, you know, you got a good converter going at essentially double resolution versus a good converter at the time going 2x resolution versus a good converter at the time going flat. I don't think it's true anymore. How good converters are now, even like, you know, kind of mid-rangey ones like the Scarlett and stuff, like the converters are so good now you can't hear the difference between 44.1 and 88.2.
Wow.
People will argue about that.
Yeah.
But if you sit down and you listen to it, like, it's hard.
Yeah.
Plus, I mean, everything I record 44.1. 44.1 24-bit. And to me, it sounds fine.
I think it goes along with that 1080p, 4K, 8K.
Yeah.
You know, like you're pushing it to a point where it's like, can anyone sense that?
Right.
Or is the sense even beyond? Is it the uncanny valley where it's too many frames per second,
right.
and you're like, no, it doesn't register
yeah.
correctly.
It's a 30 megapixel camera versus a 300 megapixel camera, and I'm viewing the picture on my phone.
Yeah. Through what medium
right.
will dictate in a lot of ways
yeah.
where you have to go as far as quality.
Most people can't hear above like 16K anyways. Like,
yeah, it's shut down.
Hearing is shot.
Yep.
So,
right.
Yeah. So
well,
you picked a good topic. I have opinions on that.
Well, I think you'll also know right away about this one.
Yeah.
And this is a classic form question. Where do you find frequencies accumulating where you're dealing with mud that you're always just going to clear this out? You know right away,
yeah.
You're like, this has got to go.
Yeah. A lot of times it's that, it's a small band, but it's like 300 to 400. Like that range always seems to like just pick up a bunch of stuff because 300 to 400 is that area you want in there and controlled if you're doing like a folk song. But if you're doing metal, it gets just removed.
Yeah.
Like, because, you know, if you're doing metal, you want the click and you want like some body, and that's kind of it. Like,
right.
Dip the rest out.
Genre depending.
Yeah.
But also, is there, when you do that in metal, that massive reduction, is there ever, or is it, I guess, genre specific, but like, do you ever feel like something's missing? Or is it really just clearing room for things to represent and express in a way?
It's usually just clearing room for that.
Okay.
And it depends on the kick, like how dramatic you make it, you know, and you know the type of metal. Like, you know, there's big differences between. There's so many genres in there even. But that's like the 300 to 400 is like where I tend to pull. 300 to like 450 is where I tend to pull things out to make room. Like I said, like bottom of electric guitar is there, like. Not the exact bottom, because, you know, it's really like 100 is where it starts, and then 250 is the warmth, and then... but there's a lot of stuff. And I find, like, you know, human voice, like, the low-end presence of a human voice is, like, in there, too. So by clearing that, like I won't take it out for vocals. I'll have a high-pass filter on vocals that ends up being somewhere between 100 and 200.
To cut the sibilants?
No, the other side. I cut out the low end.
Oh, yes.
And I am one of those people who high pass like kind of everything. Like,
so what are you rolling off when you're high passing everything?
Like it depends. So like, my default tends to be I like kick on the bottom and then bass lift just above it. That sounds correct to me.
Yeah.
I hear records when I hear records where the bass owns the sub and the kick, because I'm of the camp that one of them has to own the sub. They both can't.
This is a really good question right here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which one owns that territory?
Yeah. So I like kick, because I think the kick's just it's like punchier and it's a beat and it drives. And if it's bass, it's like bass is sustaining. So you just end up getting
yeah, you need melodic definition for the bass.
Right.
That would be lost if it were occupying underneath the kick.
Yeah, so it's odd when I hear bass living under kick, unless it's like an upright bass and it's room drums. Like
yeah.
That kind of world.
Right.
Like if you were doing like Django Reinhardt stuff, like yeah, upright can live underneath the kick in that case because the kick is all room sound. Like
there's a lot of it's all kind of bleeding in a way that makes sense there. Yeah.
Yeah, but I just like the kick owns the bottom because it's rhythm, like, and you need like that's what I want to feel. Like, if I've got a subwoofer, like that's what I want the subwoofer to be working on. I want it to be a little kick drum. Right.
Not like something that, because if the bass is functioning on the lower end of the spectrum and you're trying to listen to that through a sub, or you're trying to feel something, it really is mud at that point, right?
Yeah. But like I said, acoustic guitar, electric guitar, synths, voice, kick, snare, overhead, like they all have 300 hertz. That's like the one thing.
Yeah.
Like a bass guitar isn't going to have 10K, in any meaningful way.
Right.
Like, so there's no, the cymbals can own that all day, like, in the air of the voice. But yeah, that 300 to 450 is the trickiest.
Yeah. All right. How about when you're working on a master for someone and you're looking at increasing loudness, but you're trying to do that without clipping or overly compressing the track, how do you find ways to push it without like pushing it too far? Because it's got to be a slim margin at some point, right?
Yeah. Having a really good limiter is like a big part of it.
Okay.
And I do it in the box. I use a limiter whose name I can't remember now. Softtube makes it. It's old. It's a clone of a WEISS.
Okay.
And it's great. It's like you can push it to where you're just razoring off the top of the waveform, and it's not that it's hard to hear that it's clipped to hell, but it's like it's pretty gentle feeling still. So I think that's part. But what I'll do is I usually like to combine saturation, which is like a very light clipping essentially, like if I'm using tape, like a tape sound, like tape plugin, or pushing it to where it's clipping into red here and there, like just touching the top of it. Universal Audio makes a really good Studer. They make a good Studer, but I meant the AMPEX. They make an AMPEX, the tape mastering deck that everybody used forever. That's one thing that I like. I like to use the tools that everybody's been using since the 60s, like, because they work.
Tried and true.
Right, and that's how my ear works. Like, I grew up on those songs. My ear is attached to those pieces of gear. And then over time, I learned what piece of gear was what, and I'm like, oh, that's why my ear likes that. Like, yeah. So I'll start with gentle saturation with like a tape or something like that, then into like a more traditional compressor. And when I'm doing mastering, I basically mid-side everything. So I process the mid separate from the side, which I really like because I can treat them individually. Because if you listen to mid versus side, they're drastically different things.
Yeah.
So being able to like, if there's a lot of like, if the drums weren't really compressed and smoothed out, or the guitars weren't, like if things are really moving on there, but the vocal is already like, pretty heavily limited and stuff like that, I can take care of them separately.
That's cool.
Which is great.
Yeah.
Because 9 times out of 10, the vocal's straight up the middle. Like,
right.
And even if it's not, it's close. Like,
are you defining the sides as the right-left pan, or a little more like of a three-dimensional up and down?
Yeah, so what it ends up being, so if how they do mid-side is, you have the middle, and that's everything in the middle. But what it ends up being is they use a phase trick to do it. So if you take the left and you take the right and you put them out of phase of each other, it removes the middle, because the middle is everything that was exactly the same.
Okay.
So by inverting the phase of one side, you lose the middle.
That is some voodoo shit to me. That I don't understand how phase inversion can cancel things to the point where you're isolating an instrument or something.
Yeah, it's great.
What the hell?
So if I'm moving air like that.
Here, hold that like right at your chest.
Oh, yeah. So if I'm moving air like that, and that's literally air, like air pressure, which is all sound is.
Okay.
To make that go away, I just do that. And now all my sound pressure on one side is pushing against the sound pressure on the other side, and nothing happens because I have equal pressure pushing. It's like going like this, like I'm not moving anymore.
Wow.
And that's all that phase is. And that's why if I've got, a wave, and then I have a wave that's the same thing, just moved over a little bit, they cancel each other. They almost cancel each other out, or you lose a bunch of frequencies.
Right.
And you can do phase tricks that are good and interesting, like doing mid-side stuff.
But it can also be like the death of you
It
to
can also be terrible.
run into like a phase. See, that's something that's been
And it can
interesting. To me,
sound
is like, how do you know what are you hearing when you're hearing a phase issue? Is it really just a lack of there's no energy in this part? Or
it depends. So for kick, if I'm not feeling low end, something's out of phase. Especially if it's like a mic I know and stuff like that, I'm like, this mic doesn't sound right. It's not how it's supposed to sound. You basically get this gut feeling that something's wrong. This is not how this is supposed to be. And chances are it's a phase. So then I'll flip phase and see if it's better. Because you're never going to get... I don't like going in the DAW and realigning everything afterwards. It changes everything. It makes the recording sound different because you recorded it with that phase. That's kind of what it's supposed to be. It's fine.
Yeah.
And if I've got... Those room mics aren't very far away. They're 6 feet off the kick? But sometimes they're back on the concrete. They're 12 feet away from the kick. I want that space.
Yeah.
Because that's why it sounds like it's pushed back further in a room.
But does the overhead at that distance ever create a cancellation problem because of it not being equal to the other mics?
It creates a cancellation, but it's one that sounds correct.
Yes. Okay. Now we're getting to the heart of this thing.
Yeah. Overheads. So space pair. If you have any space pair mics, that's a phase problem. The only way to not have a phase problem or have minimal phase problem is to XY.
Right, and then you have no.
But then you don't have much stereo.
Yeah.
The stereo field is a phase. Is because of phase.
That's
and that's
beautiful.
why it's the only thing I ever measured. But I measure the distance of the overheads to the snare.
Yeah. Right.
Because I want that snare to sound directly in the middle of them.
And what is your preferred distance measurement on those?
In this room, and it would vary room to room, it would vary by genre, something smaller, more intimate jazz would come down, or up, I don't know, it depends. In this room, 9 times out of 10 where I leave it is about 50 to 54.
Okay.
That works for those mics in this room.
Yeah.
But there's no rules for that. There's a thing that's happened where people who never worked in a professional studio are making YouTube videos now.
Right.
And they didn't do it every day. They're learning by themselves, and they read about Glenn John's technique, but they don't realize that was for a mono drum recording.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. So it's they're getting half truth. They do Glenn John's, and then they're like, why am I getting so much floor tom?
Yeah.
And why is it way over here?
Yeah. You're hitting something that I've seen and thought, this is not good.
Yeah.
And then also the idea that in 25 years, the kids that listen to those wrong techniques will say, if you want to sound like the albums you love, you better set it up this incorrect Glenn John's way,
right.
you know?
Yeah.
But it's just funny to think in this conversation about phase and polarity and things that oftentimes that wrongness can be the right thing.
Yeah.
It just depends really on what you're after in the long run, I guess.
And like I said, when I start, because I'll check phase. I'll go through, when I'm always setting up a session at first, I'll start with the kick, normal. I'll treat the kick as the main point of phase.
Yeah,
out's out, and that's fine. Really doesn't matter, but I've always had this thing of I want as much to be pushing air out first as opposed to sucking in. And if things can work together in that, great.
Yeah.
But if somebody's doing a build on drums, and I've got the phase flipped on the tom too, because it adds more bottom. There's something in my brain that's yeah, but that's pulling the speaker in, and the other two are pushing the speaker out.
Yeah.
So I want stuff to push the speaker out.
I think that's a good philosophy to have, because you could get lost in this process.
Right.
And then, like you said, by the end, you've undone the way you recorded it, and you can tell.
Yeah, but you can't always do it. So what I'll do is I'll start with a kick, and I'll bring stuff up and start flip the phase.
Mm-hmm.
Like if the snare sounds better flipped, it sounds better.
Yeah.
And if it still sounds funny, that's when the mic gets moved.
Right. Okay, let me ask you this. Working on a board versus working in the box.
Yeah.
Is it... Obviously, let's just say that both are equal in terms of the internal organs of each piece.
Yeah.
Which, is there any positive going one way over the other?
Yeah.
Or is it just a personal preference for engineers?
Right. So recording on a board, I like because you can make decisions going in. Mm-hmm. And you can track those decisions.
Right.
And then you can't change it again. There's no like putting that plugin back or removing that plugin. Like you're committed to the sound that when you were in the room with the band, like we agreed this sounds good, cool. Mm-hmm. But it's more dangerous. Like if you're applying compression and shit, like that's a choice.
In
like,
every project I've ever worked on, I've most times never really liked the first choice. I've had to make a series of choices to attain that outcome. And so the thought of here's something locked in stone undoes the whole process of what making something good over time is.
Right.
That's like what recording is.
Right. Well, and it's the idea of like, if it's a $150,000 console, they sound really good.
Yeah,
like,
it's
the
gonna
EQ
sound good.
sounds great.
Yeah.
Like if you're tracking in on like an old Neve, like a good 70s Neve, or like, and they all have their own thing. Mm-hmm. Like a Neve sounds different than an API, sounds different than a SSL. And I think that's part of it. Like if you're working with boards, knowing how they work and knowing what they're made for, and that.
So you feel like adding or subtracting frequency, both approaches are acceptable depending on the situation. Because some people are like, never add. Yeah. Always subtract the bad stuff. Don't increase the good stuff.
Yeah. No.
But sometimes I guess increasing the good stuff is a good thing.
Yeah. Like the only way to get modern pop high end just getting this tip.
Right. Yeah.
There. But it's
a lot of people think
sharp. It gets sharp when you really push it. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Yeah, I got lost in EQ.
There's a lot there.
Yeah.
Let's jump to
one thing about in the box versus out of the box.
Sure.
So I use, when I mix it all the time, I use this guy, which is meant to be like an SSL. It's got an SSL.
Hold that just a little higher.
Yeah.
What is this thing?
Cartel 1 by Softtube.
Okay.
They're super cool. So they act. Mine's kind of dirty right now, but it's the same for. The four bands are styled off of the SSL, but I have different plugins where this can be an SSL, it can be an API, it can be an Neve, it can be an old tube console. But what I love is that I can move Q and frequency at the same time, or frequency and gain. The tactile nature of hardware, and it's all plugins, it's just a controller. But being able to, especially for like compressor, being able to like, change ratio and parallel with my hands while listening and not clicking and looking, just listening and moving and like that helps.
That tactile,
So I'm a big proponent of tactile.
Interesting.
And the last thing I'll say about like an analog mixing session versus in the box, analog mixing sessions are a giant pain in the ass because recall. Like, how many times have you gone back to a mix? Like, imagine going back to a mix in analog world. Like, where you have patch bay, but instead of just one U, it's that patch bay.
Yeah.
And it's geared all around here. And you have to take pictures of everything and mark it. And then you have to, the board, most of them have recall now. But some of the old Neves, a lot of Neves don't, a lot of APIs don't. When I would recall analog sessions for people, it was 3 hours to get the mix back.
Yeah, brutal.
Like,
So there's some pros there.
So a lot of times when you print mixes back then, it was, print the mix flat, print the mix, Vox up 1.5 dB, Vox up 3, Vox down 1.5. Like,
I need the box louder.
Yeah.
Oh, got it. Got that one.
Exactly. So you would print alternates of kind of everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Just going backwards.
No, don't want to.
And there's a good chance somebody else uses it, unless it's a private studio, which not a lot of people have an SSL or Neve at their house.
Yeah.
Like, other people have used all that stuff. Channels might be broken.
So, what are 2 plugins that you can't live without? Let's just say one can be a compressor, but like maybe don't double the types, like 2 separate things. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You know, one plugin that I love is the Studer A800 tape machine plugin. Okay. I put that on. That's on every drum. Sometimes it'll be on more, and I use it for a couple things. I use it for saturation, just by driving the tape, and I'll use different. It's funny. I use the tape formulas depending on what was around, like what I'm going for. So like almost every record you heard for a long time in through the 90s was 456 formula tape. It's got a thing. The high end's not as bright, and I'll do it at 30 eps because it reacts the same way. If I'm going for something where I want it a little bit not softer, squishier, maybe squishier, but like better low end.
Okay.
What else? Oh, and then I use it as like a faux compressor too, oddly enough, because you can change the bias of the tape, and as you kind of bias it higher, things seem to even out a bit. There's less dynamic range as you over bias, and if you start to under bias, you get a little bit more dynamic range. So you can kind of use it as this cheap kind of first thing. What I'll do all the time for drums, I'll have the drums that I recorded. The first thing I'll do is I'll go in and put the Studer plugin on every drum channel, set it to how I think it sounds right, and then commit it, and then I'm done.
Yeah.
Because the plugin does take up a lot of DSP.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
like I don't want it sitting around, but I also like those are decisions I just want to make. Like this is what my bass.
You know you can trust this.
Yeah, like because nothing's super aggressive. So I'll commit that all right away. Second plugin. Compression is so weird because they all sound so different. Like, so there's basically, you know, I use them so different. All right, I don't want to give a reverb plugin though because that's so. I'll pick this one because it lives on my master bus.
Okay, that's what I'm looking for. What is like always there?
It's the first thing on the master bus is a PULTEC EQ emulation.
Okay.
And it'd be the same thing if I was in a room. You go to any legit, like any real deal, like old studio that's been around, there's 2 PULTECs. They got stereo PULTECs for that. Or for vocals. Like it does a lot. So that lives on every mix.
Just makes things sound good.
Yeah,
thing.
And if it's funny because I still have fun with it. You go through and you leave it on the whole mixing process. You set it at the beginning and then you never touch it again. You'll get late into the mix process and you just turn it off for fun. It's like holy shit, that sounds way different. Like so, my whole mix gets spaced around that. And then I always I go into a compressor too.
Yeah,
after that.
yeah.
Just to like touch, like something just to kind of tame it. So something that if I push the kick into it, like. Mixing into a compressor takes practice because you can just keep pushing stuff into it and then you end up with this kind of wall into it and it sounds like you just don't have any headroom. There's no air. So you have to be careful with it.
Yeah.
But I think it makes mixing a lot easier once you get used to it.
Yeah.
So, and for that I normally use the WEISS KRAMER Pi plugin. I've used it forever because everything's in the box for me. I don't outboard gear for that stuff.
If you don't have to, you might as well not.
Yeah, and there's analog outboard stuff that sounds great, and I would love to, but budget versus what I'm doing for people and stuff like that. It'd be crazy to buy that stuff.
Yeah,
there's no return on it.
Okay, final question. This is a little more conceptual, I guess, but what? stripping away all the technical expertise you have about recording and thinking just almost like philosophically about it, what would be your advice to someone who's working in the field, or, you know, amateur to professional?
Yeah.
What is like the overarching thesis that you've come to know about the work you do?
Yeah, I mean, two things come to mind immediately. Like, it's not yours. Like, you can apply your art to it, but it's the band's. Like it's their stuff. You know, they're correct. Like, what they want to hear is what they want to hear. And if you can't, if you're having problems coming to that place, like, you're not a good fit.
Yeah,
like,
right. And it's okay to say, I don't think this is working.
Yeah, totally. Like,
because you can't totally cancel you.
Yeah.
But I understand what you're saying too.
Yeah, and like, you know, having a difference of opinion of a band of like, oh, I want to sound like we're just a band in a room. Okay, this is what a band in a room sounds like to me. I disagree. It's like, oh, okay, well, we don't have the same vocabulary for these things.
Yes, and
like,
that makes this impossible in some ways.
Right, yeah. Like, I just have no way to work with you.
Right.
But I think the most important thing is like the hang and being in a room and like, and the psychology of recording a band. And I think that's something, being in Nashville, working with the people I worked with, that's the thing I really learned. Like, that was the most important thing, you know, when the drummer is struggling, like, to get the part and getting mad, how much space do you give him? Do you even say anything to him before you go to the next take? Or is he just ready? Like, having that kind of empathy to the band, like, that's huge. You know, knowing when people need a break, like, knowing who's in charge of this part of the song, even, like, and being able to feel that. Yeah, basically, like, being an empath in the room. like really understanding, you know, what people are thinking. I think that's the hardest part of recording. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a great place to leave it, honestly, because that's really good advice.
Yeah.
And also, you know, thank you for taking the time to share all your magic genius. And, you know, I need to go back and watch this like 10 times and like take notes, but eventually this will teach me something.
Nice. Yeah, anytime. I can talk about this stuff forever.
Awesome. Thanks, dude.